In Coyote Bend, no one knew the name of the man who left flowers beneath the broken cross every night. They only knew that by morning the flowers were there again, year after year, without a word of explanation, until the night a widowed woman saw him standing in the dark and realized the truth no one in town had ever imagined. Coyote Bend was a small town where the dirt road met an abandoned stretch of railroad, old enough that weeds had started growing through the rusted gaps. Anyone who had lived there longer than a single rainy season knew three things never changed: the wind, the red dust, and the broken cross at the end of the road. It leaned to one side, the rotted wood showing its grain, as if it no longer had the strength to stand, but still held its ground for the sake of those who had fallen there 20 years earlier. Eleanor Mayfield knew that story well. She was the only widow in town still living alone, and the only person who remembered every name spoken in the church on the day of the accident. Her husband had died in a different tragedy, but on nearly the same stretch of road. Those losses tied her heart to this dry patch of land and kept her from leaving, even when she sometimes wished she could. Eleanor ran a small cafe on the main street, the only place in town with hot coffee in the morning and a stew good enough to make travelers stop. She was used to unlocking the door before sunrise and closing it just as the sky dimmed. But there was one thing she could never get used to: the strange bouquet of flowers that appeared beneath the broken cross every morning. At first, she thought it was coincidence, someone passing by and leaving a tribute for the dead. But then it continued. Every morning there was a new bouquet, always tied with an old strip of leather, always made of wildflowers that did not grow anywhere near town. Someone had to travel far, across rocky slopes and mesquite thickets to pick them. There was only one man in Coyote Bend strong enough to make that trek every day. But he was also the one man no one liked to speak to: Jonas Hale. He had arrived in town about 6 months earlier, tall, broad-shouldered, hair gone gray too early, his face weathered by sun and wind. He did the jobs no one else wanted: clearing weeds around the old bridge, fixing warped boards on the abandoned rail sheds, repairing things that were no longer his responsibility. He did not drink, gamble, or tell stories. He always wore gloves. He always walked alone. So people called him by a name that carried more suspicion than kindness: the Silent Drifter. But Eleanor never thought Jonas was dangerous. There was something fragile in his eyes every time she handed him a cup of coffee, something only she seemed to notice. Perhaps because she had carried the same quiet grief for years herself. One early fall morning, as she brought her own small bunch of daisies to place beneath the cross, she found the first strange bouquet. She touched the leather tie gently, then looked around. The road was empty. The sun had not yet risen. Only a thin trail of dust floated in the air, as if someone had just walked away moments earlier. She said nothing, but her heartbeat quickened. 3 days later, there was another bouquet, then another the following week, then another, and another. Not a single day without one. By then, the whole town had begun whispering. Is he trying to atone for something? Maybe he caused the accident back then. Maybe someone he loved died there. But no one asked him. Folks in small towns always found it easier to whisper behind backs than to look someone in the eye. Eleanor was different. She was not curious because she wanted to expose anyone. She simply recognized the shape of that sadness. It looked too much like her own. An even stranger thing happened. Every night, when she turned off the cafe lights and glanced out toward the road, she saw a tall shadow walking toward the broken cross. His steps were slow and steady, as if he was walking across his own memories. One night, the wind picked up sharply and rattled the cafe windows. Eleanor stood inside, watching through the foggy glass, and saw Jonas kneel at the cross. He adjusted something, placed something gently at its base, and then remained there for a long moment. He looked like a man apologizing to someone who was no longer alive. Eleanor did not yet know it, but that moment would be the first thread pulling her closer to Jonas, inch by inch, over the months to come. For now, she stood behind the dim window, holding a warm cup of coffee, and for the first time in years, her heart tightened, not from her own loneliness, but from something she sensed in him. What she did not know was that the bouquet he left that night was the first sign that Jonas's long-kept secret had begun to unravel. In the days that followed, Coyote Bend began paying closer attention to the broken cross. Not because it was beautiful, but because every morning there was a fresh bouquet at its base. Wildflowers of every kind appeared there, sometimes long-leaf violets, sometimes white yucca blossoms. Some mornings there were bright red blooms that could only be picked deep in the dry southern ridges. And the strangest part was that the flowers were always fresh, never wilted or bruised. That meant someone had gone out at night, in the cold and the wind, gathered them, and carried them all the way back to that cross. People in town started guessing at first in a half-joking way. Then, in the quiet, suspicious tone small towns know too well. He must have caused the accident years ago. Maybe he owes one of the dead something. Or worse, maybe he is hiding something no one wants to say out loud. Jonas Hale heard every whisper, yet he never reacted. He simply sat in the corner booth of Eleanor's cafe like he always did, nodding when she refilled his coffee, thanking her in that gravelly voice, and quietly finishing his simple meal. Eleanor, however, felt the shift in town more sharply than anyone. The more the rumors spread, the more people pulled away from Jonas. They avoided the booth he sat in. They did not greet him when they walked by. Some even glanced away as if meeting his eye might stir something they did not want to face. But Jonas did not seem angry or hurt. If anything, he became quieter. He worked more, cleared weeds, fixed the warped storage barn door, repaired a section of fence behind her cafe without being asked. He did not mention it. He simply did the work and disappeared before anyone could thank him. Eleanor began to worry that the town would blame him for anything that went wrong simply because he was different. That thought made her pay closer attention. One windy morning, she stepped out behind the cafe and saw Jonas standing by the fence, not hiding from people, not waiting for praise. He was reinforcing a loose post so it would not fall in the strong gusts. In his hands were an old hammer and several new pieces of wood. When he noticed her, he startled slightly, then dipped his head politely and went right back to work. Eleanor watched him for a long moment. His movements were steady and careful, the kind of motions a man learns from years of hard labor. And then an unexpected thought rose inside her, gentle and certain. A man who does things like this cannot be the monster they whisper about. That same morning, she stepped outside with a pot of hot coffee and approached him. Jonas paused, a little embarrassed, but accepted the cup as if it were the most valuable thing anyone in town had ever given him. "Thank you," he said softly. "I just did not want your fence to go down in the wind." She nodded, pulling her sleeves closer for warmth. "And the flowers?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Jonas lowered his gaze to the dirt. He did not look away in anger. It was more like he did not want to answer. Or perhaps he did not believe he could. Eleanor understood then that whatever lay behind those bouquets was not something a person could ask directly. It felt more like an old wound. The harder you pressed, the more it would tear. But at that moment, she knew one thing clearly. The man standing in front of her was not the dark mystery the town feared. He was someone carrying something heavy, something far larger than the rumors people used to entertain themselves. And Eleanor also knew that someday she would have to ask him the question everyone else avoided. "Why do you leave flowers there every night?" But that would be a conversation for another day. That night, the wind was stronger than usual. It was the dry, sharp kind of southwest wind that scraped over wooden roofs and made them creak as if someone were clawing at the boards. Eleanor had just locked up the cafe when she noticed the broken cross leaning so far to one side, it looked ready to fall with the next gust. She wrapped her coat around her and at first planned to simply look from a distance, but something uneasy pushed her to walk faster. When she reached the end of the road, she stopped in her tracks. There was a figure already standing at the cross, broad shoulders blocking most of its splintered wood. Jonas. He was trying to steady the cross, holding the cold wood with bare hands, his gloves lying on the ground where the wind had blown them off. Eleanor had never seen him like this, not the quiet, withdrawn man everyone in town thought they knew, but someone trying to hold up something that meant far more to him than an old piece of timber. She stepped closer, partly afraid he might fall, partly because she could not turn away. "Do you want me to hold the other side?" she asked. Jonas turned, startled. In the faint glow from a porch lantern nearby, she saw it clearly, a long scar running from his wrist almost to his palm. An old scar, but deep, as if it had been cut by something sharp and unforgiving. He tried to hide his hand behind his back, but it was too late. Eleanor had already seen it. "I just do not want it to fall," Jonas said quietly. His voice shook slightly, but from the cold wind, not fear. Eleanor braced one side of the cross to help steady it. They stood closer than they ever had before, their breath mixing with the cold night air. "You do not have to do this alone," she said. Jonas stayed silent for a long moment before answering. "I have done everything alone for a long time." There was something in his voice then, heavy and low, like a stone dropping into a deep well. Eleanor did not ask more. Not because she lacked curiosity, but because some wounds can only be opened by the person who carries them. Together, they secured the cross. Jonas wedged a large stone at its base, every movement slow and deliberate, as if doing it wrong might bring something worse than a fallen marker. When they finished, Jonas sat down on the ground, leaning back slightly against the cross. He exhaled like a man who had been carrying years of weight in his chest. The wind roared against the fence, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jonas said quietly, without looking at her, 20 years ago, I was the man responsible for checking this stretch of track. I was supposed to be here on the day of the accident." Eleanor felt her breath catch. She had wondered, but she had not expected the truth to come this close. Jonas continued, almost in a whisper, as if he himself could hardly believe he was saying it. "My daughter was sick. I left my post for a few hours to go home and check on her. When I came back, it had already happened. 3 people dead. 2 alive because I reached them in time." He looked down at the scar on his hand. "This one. I got it pulling a child out from under a wagon wheel, but I could not save the others. No one forgave me for that. And I..." He let out a quiet, painful laugh. "I never forgave myself either." Eleanor did not remember when she had lowered herself to sit beside him. She just realized the wind no longer felt as cold. It felt like it was moving through a wound that had finally been opened after 20 long years. "You saved 2 people," she said softly. Not everyone could have done that. Jonas shook his head. But I was not here when I should have been. The words dropped between them, not like an accusation, but like a confession spoken in the dark. To Eleanor, it sounded less like guilt and more like a man exhausted from carrying the same regret for too long. And in that moment, she understood something she had never understood before. The bouquets he placed at the broken cross were not about guilt or trying to appear righteous. They were an apology whispered to the three who had died, every night, for 20 years. An apology no one asked for and no one ever answered. Eleanor placed her hand on his arm, lightly, the way you would place a hand on a wall that had stood through decades of harsh weather. Jonas tensed at first, then did not pull away. It was the first moment in this story when she saw him not as the silent wanderer of the town, but as a man worn down by years of carrying something no one else could see. And she knew that from this night on, everything would begin to change. After the night Eleanor saw Jonas steady the broken cross, the town began to change in ways she never wanted. News traveled faster than the wind. The first person who saw them standing together was the blacksmith. The second was the woman who ran the general store. By midday, all of Coyote Bend already believed Jonas had confessed his sins at the cross during the storm. Of course, the story that spread was nothing like the truth. It twisted the way small-town rumors always did. He admitted he caused the accident years ago. He came back to hide the evidence. Looks like he's pulling the widow to his side so he has an ally. One wrong version of a story was enough for everyone to treat it as fact. That afternoon, Eleanor's diner was busier than usual, but not because people were hungry. They wanted to see whether she looked different after standing beside Jonas the night before. Some customers whispered to each other, but made sure their whispers were loud enough for her to hear. I am not sitting near that table if Jonas comes in. No one knows what he might do. The widow should be careful. Lonely women are easy to fool. What angered Eleanor was not that they spoke poorly of Jonas. It was that they spoke as if he were dangerous, even though none of them knew what had really happened. When Jonas stepped inside, all the murmuring stopped, but the looks did not soften. He nodded at Eleanor and sat at his usual table by the window. No one greeted him. No one even pretended to. Eleanor placed a cup of hot coffee in front of him, without needing to ask. Jonas looked up at her with tired eyes, carrying the weight of every rumor he had heard since morning. If I am causing trouble for you, he said quietly, I can eat somewhere else. Eleanor shook her head immediately. You are not bothering anyone. They just like talking about things they do not understand. Jonas did not argue, but she could tell her words had reached him. In all the towns he had passed through, no one had ever defended him. Not once. That afternoon, things escalated. 3 men approached his table, including Harmon, the cattle rancher. He blocked the light from the window and said bluntly, I heard you confess to the widow last night. Jonas lifted his head. He did not react with anger, only with the calm of someone used to being misunderstood. I did not confess anything. Then what are the flowers for? Harmon leaned closer, pressing a hand on the table as if trying to force Jonas back. Jonas did not move. The flowers are my business. Not in this town, Harmon snapped. People here deserve to know what you are hiding. Eleanor stepped forward immediately and set her tray down on the nearest table. Her voice stayed calm, but the cold edge in it was unmistakable. Harmon, you are talking in my diner. If you want to drive customers away, you can do it outside. He froze. surprised that someone as gentle as Eleanor would confront him so directly. "Eleanor, you do not know what kind of man he is." "And you," she said, looking straight at him, "do not know him at all." Silence settled over the room. Finally, Harmon muttered something under his breath and walked out with the other two men. Jonas looked at her, gratitude clear in his eyes, even though he did not say the words. He exhaled softly. "You did not have to stand up for me." "That was not standing up for you," she replied. "I just do not like seeing a good man treated like a bad one." For the first time since he had come to Coyote Bend, Jonas Hale smiled. Not a full smile, but enough to make Eleanor's heart tremble just a little. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both understood something had changed. They were no longer just a diner owner and a quiet customer. They were two people, two wounded hearts, standing on the same side in a town full of rumors and short on kindness. Rain began falling before the sky was fully dark. It was the kind of autumn rain that came down hard and fast, turning the ground into thick mud within minutes. In Coyote Bend, storms like this always stirred unease, because everyone remembered the accident 20 years ago that happened on a night just like this. Eleanor closed the diner early and pulled the canvas cover over the windows to keep the water out. When she stepped into the backyard to check the chicken coop, she heard something faint. It was not the rain. It was not the wind. It sounded like wood hitting the ground, a sound she had heard from a distance many times. The broken cross leaning too far under the force of the storm. A knot of worry tightened in her chest. She grabbed her cloak, pulled her hood up, lit a small oil lamp, and hurried toward the narrow road leading to the far end of town. Darkness fell quickly. Each step felt as if she was walking deeper into a wall of night. The wind pushed against her so hard that her lamp flickered dangerously, almost going out twice. When she reached the cross, she stopped cold. A man was already there, kneeling, both hands pressed against the weathered wood to keep it from toppling. Jonas. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with dirt, but he did not let go. Eleanor ran toward him, set her lamp down on the driest patch she could find, and grabbed the other side of the cross to help hold it upright. Jonas looked at her with breathless urgency. In his eyes, she saw something she had never seen in him before. Fear. "I thought it was going to fall," he said, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "I did not want to lose it again." The words sounded like a confession pulled from somewhere deep inside him. Without thinking, Eleanor answered, "They are not the same. This is just an old piece of wood." Jonas held her gaze for a long moment, as if deciding whether to say something he had kept buried for decades. The rain grew heavier, soaking through their clothes until every movement felt weighted. Still, they stayed where they were, holding the cross together. Then Jonas drew a slow breath, the kind taken by someone about to face the hardest part of his own story. "No one knows this," he said quietly, eyes still fixed on the wood. "There were not 3 people who died that night." Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. There were 4. The wind howled louder, nearly blowing out the lamp, but his words cut through everything. She waited for him to continue. Jonas swallowed, each memory hitting him like a blade. "I saved a child. I saved a woman. I saved a man. But there was another little boy. I could not reach him in time." His jaw tightened. "I heard him calling under the wagon. I tried. This scar is from the moment I reached for him." The scar on his wrist glowed pale under the trembling light of the oil lamp. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Not because of the story itself, but because of the way Jonas spoke, as if every word cost him a piece of breath. "No one in this town knows about the fourth child," he continued, "because I was the only one who saw he was still breathing, and I was the only one left when he was not." The storm pounded around them. Eleanor placed her hand on his cold, rain-soaked arm. "Jonas." He shook his head, swallowing the ache. "I did not come back here to make peace with the 3 who died," he said, his voice heavy like a stone sinking into deep water. "I came back to speak to the boy." Eleanor tightened her hand on his arm, not to comfort him, but to remind him he was not standing alone in the storm anymore. They held the cross together for a few more moments, the wind rushing through the trees like a voice from another time. Then they braced the wood with rocks, made sure it would stand through the night, and finally stepped back. When the cross was secure, Jonas looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes were not weighed down the way they usually were. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Anyone else seeing me out here tonight would think I was losing my mind." Eleanor gave a small smile. "No, I think you are someone trying to hold on to something everyone else abandoned long ago." And this time, Jonas did not look away. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet, leaving long streaks of mud down the main road. Coyote Bend was quieter than usual. Shopkeepers opened later. Children stayed indoors because the air was still cold. But one thing stirred the whole town. The broken cross had been set upright, steadier than before, and beneath it lay a new bouquet, strangely beautiful. The flowers were tied with a clean strip of cloth, not the worn leather Jonas had used for years. Someone had cut the fabric neatly, as if prepared by hand that very morning. People stopped to look, then looked at each other. No one said a word. They knew the storm had been rough. They also knew no one in town would walk out there in the wind and rain except one man, Jonas Hale. But what confused them more were the fresh footprints around the cross. There were not just one set. There were 2. Inside the diner, Eleanor kept busy clearing tables, but her eyes carried a calm warmth that people were not used to seeing. Something had changed in her after last night. She did not look as tired as she usually did. She did not look as sad. She looked like someone holding on to something quiet and important. Jonas stepped into the diner with his usual hesitation, but when he saw Eleanor glance toward him, his expression softened. It was as if simply seeing her loosened something inside him. Other people in the diner noticed it too, and suddenly they were silent. Not the kind of silence filled with suspicion, like before, but the silence of a small town realizing the things they thought they knew might not have been the truth. Jonas took his usual seat. Eleanor brought his coffee. But this time, when she set the cup down, his hand brushed against hers. It lasted only a moment, so quick anyone watching might have thought it was accidental. But to both of them, it felt like a shift, a quiet turning of something deep inside. Jonas withdrew first, a little embarrassed, hiding a small smile he was not used to showing. Eleanor did not say anything either. She simply pressed her lips together, a soft warmth blooming in her chest. Not a sudden romance, not a childish flutter, but the kind of feeling 2 grown people, both scarred by loss, recognize as a place they can finally rest. Around noon, the blacksmith walked into the diner. He took off his hat, set it on the nearest table, and walked straight to Jonas. The entire diner went still. Eleanor stood behind the counter, gripping her towel tightly. Jonas looked up, not defensive, but bracing himself for something unpleasant. What happened next surprised everyone. The blacksmith sighed, sat down across from Jonas, and said, Last night, I went out back to check the road behind my place. I saw the cross, and I saw the footprints." Jonas said nothing. The man continued, "I was wrong. We were wrong. We spread the wrong story about you. We thought you were hiding something dangerous. None of us guessed you were the one keeping that cross standing all these years." The diner fell completely silent. Then something no one expected happened. The blacksmith extended his hand. "If you want to stay here, Coyote Bend has room for you." Jonas stared at the hand for a moment, then shook it. No thank you was spoken, but the handshake said enough. It was the first visible shift in how the town saw him. After that, a few customers approached Jonas, asking careful questions, quietly apologizing for what they had once thought. Jonas only nodded. He did not blame anyone. From behind the counter, Eleanor felt her throat tighten, not from sadness, from relief. She knew that since Jonas walked into her life, everything between them and everything around them was fragile. But that noon, as she watched the town face him with different eyes, she understood something important. That moment of shared touch in the morning was not only a change between the two of them, it was the beginning of the town changing too. For Jonas, it was the first time in 20 years he was no longer standing alone beside the broken cross. And for Eleanor, it was the first time in 10 years she felt something like life returning to her chest. A few days after the heavy rain, Coyote Bend faced the kind of weather everyone who had lived here long enough recognized. The dry wind shifted direction and a dust storm rolled in. It began with small waves of dust skimming across the ground, then gusts strong enough to rattle window panes. People locked their doors and tied down their porches. In the southwest, a dust storm could rise out of nowhere, and anyone careless risked losing their footing or getting trapped in the swirling grit. That afternoon, Eleanor had just closed the diner when she noticed the chicken coop door blown open behind the building. She hurried out to tie it back before the wind grew stronger. But as she approached the stone wall by the coop, she heard a clattering noise above her. One of the heavy stones along the roof edge had loosened during the stormy night, and now it needed only one more strong gust to send it crashing straight down to where she stood. It fell. The only difference was that it did not fall on her. Jonas appeared from behind the corner like another gust of wind. He grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the way, just as the stone slammed into the ground and shattered into several large pieces. The crash was loud enough to make neighbors open their windows. Eleanor stumbled into his chest, breathless with fear and dust. Jonas kept her steady, his rough hands firm on her shoulders. When she looked up, their eyes met through the spinning red grit, and something in her tightened in a way she had never felt before. Not from fear, but from realizing that the man she once thought lived only with regret still protected others on instinct, even when he did not realize it himself. Several townspeople had seen Jonas pull her away from danger. They saw him shield her. They saw the worry in his eyes as he checked whether she was hurt. A brief moment, but enough to shatter every ugly whisper they had spoken about him. The blacksmith was the first to reach them. "Good Lord, you saved her life." Another voice added, "If you had been a second later." People stared at Jonas with an expression he had never earned from them before. Not suspicion, not caution. For the first time, they saw him as an ordinary man, a man afraid of losing someone, a man with a heart. And Jonas, after making sure Eleanor was truly unharmed, said only one quiet sentence, his voice almost unsteady. "You scared me." Such simple words. But to Eleanor, they were more than concern. They were a confession. a sign that she was no longer standing outside the wall Jonas had built around himself. The dust storm faded as evening settled, when the others drifted away, leaving only the two of them beside the fallen stones. Eleanor spoke softly. "Thank you." Jonas shook his head, eyes lowered to the dust-covered ground. "No, I just did not want to lose anyone else." In that still moment, they did not need to say anything more. They both understood what had been growing between them, from the stormy night to this very moment. Something neither of them believed their hearts would ever open to again. Coyote Bend remained a small town with dusty streets and winds that came without warning. The broken cross still stood at the end of the road, but now it was stronger, with a new wooden brace and carefully placed stones at its base. Every morning, townsfolk walked past and saw flowers beneath it. Not one bouquet. Two. One from Jonas. One from Eleanor. They never explained it to anyone. They never called it anything as grand as love. But anyone who had lived through a long stretch of loneliness could see it clearly. Some things do not need to be spoken. You only have to see two people standing on the same side to understand. One late winter afternoon, with the sun sinking behind the ridge, Jonas waited outside the diner while Eleanor locked the door. When she stepped out, he did not say a word. He simply offered his hand. For the first time, she took it without hesitation. They walked together toward the broken cross, where the breeze carried the faint scent of flowers across the small piece of land they both called home now. If this were a narration for an older audience, the storyteller might slow down toward the end and say, "In a place like Coyote Bend, people often believe good things belong only to the young. But sometimes the hearts that have broken the most are the ones that know how to keep a small light burning. And if you think it is too late to begin again, remember that someone once spent 20 years just to find a hand to hold, and he found it." If this story brought you a little peace, or made you think of someone you have not spoken about in a long time, stay with the Wild West Love Stories channel. Here we tell gentle stories with depth, stories touched with sorrow but lit by hope, for hearts that have lived long enough to know that everyone deserves a place to return to. Press subscribe and let me share the next story with you tonight.